Welcome to this Photoshop training tutorial. We're going to look at the tools that aren't covered in other sections. Here I've got a picture of the great Valentino Rossi. Things that we can do to begin with, we've got the Move tool. And the Move tool would allow me to move the image around. It says it can't complete my request because the layer's locked. If I was to click my Layers palette and double-click my layer to then make it a working layer, you'll see that the Move tool would allow me to move the layer around. So think of the Move tool to be able to move independent layers. Also, I have then the Arrange a Selection tools, and if I click and keep my finger down, I can make different types of marquees, as they're called. So I could, for example, draw myself a rectangular marquee. I'm going to just add a new layer, so this marquee is going to work on this new layer, and I've got this green color selected here. A good little keyboard shortcut on both Mac and Windows the same is Alt and Backspace, which floods your selection with 100% of your chosen foreground color. And then Apple D or Control D on Windows to cancel that selection. And then for my Layers palette is that I can take down the opacity of that just to make it sort of a semi-transparent panel. So the sort of things that you might use marquees for. I'm just going to delete that layer. Another feature of using the marquee tool as well is to use it to crop an image. We do have a cropping tool. One of the things that I quite often do is I tend to make a selection with this tool. So I'm just cropping in nice and tight on the image, and then I can go to the image menu and say crop, and it's now cropped according to that marquee. I'm just going to do an Apple Z or Control Z on Windows to undo that. The cropping tool would allow me to do exactly the same thing. There is an advantage to the cropping tool. It sort of grays off the area so you can see what's happening. I could even choose to rotate that crop very slightly whilst I've got this tool, and then to take it in at a tighter angle and then hit return, and it crops the image like that. Again, I'm just going to undo that. The Lasso tool, using it freehand, is a selection tool that allows you to then click and drag to create a selection, but realistically I would never use it to try to make an accurate selection. You can see this is just complete rubbish. It's a little bit better with a pen than it is by using a mouse. You can see there I've just used it to make a selection, so I don't tend to use that one for making selections. If I click and keep my finger down, there is what we call the polygon lasso tool. Now, this isn't one of my favorites, I have to say. This is where you click and you let go of the mouse and it then follows you around. This is actually better than the freehand lasso tool. It's not my preference. What is my preference, though, is to use the standard lasso tool and to use what I call the point-to-point method, which is where we hold down the Alt key and you keep the Alt key down. And if I start over here, I click and then I've let go of the mouse. And like the polygon tool, it follows you around, but you keep the mouse down for the duration of your selection. And this is still a technique I use a lot today. So I'm only doing this roughly, and then when you let go of the Alt key, it joins up the selection, so a good little tool. The other selection tool we have is the magnetic lasso, and the way the magnetic lasso works, if I click over here, you click and keep your finger down and you run along the edge of the change of colour, so where the background of his motorbike meets the background, as it tries to determine the threshold or the change between the colours and consequently make a selection for you. If there's a very strong demarcation between the colours, black against white, yellow against blue, something like that, it will work well. But here you can see, if I then just go all the way around and join back up again, it's managed to make a fairly average selection of the whole thing because it's got confused between the change in the colour. So again, I'm not really a fantastic fan of that. You can modify the contrast up here and that helps, but not really a tool I tend to use a great deal. Magic Wand tool we've covered in other sections, but if I click and keep my finger down, then we have this quick selection tool. This tool really is dictated by the size of the brush that you're working with, so the smaller the brush, the better. And here it's like a smart Magic Wand tool, so if I start to click and drag, you drag over the areas that you want to select. Now, sometimes, similar to the polygon lasso tool that I've just shown you, it does it on the demarcation of the change in colours. I personally don't find this always gives good results, and it can be a little slow to process and think about what it's doing. So the healing brush tool we've covered in another exercise, and under here are the patch tool as well as the red eye tool. The red eye tool quite simply speaks for itself. You just drag an area over a part of an image with a red eye from an indoor flash shot and it fixes it. Now the brush tool. Of course, the brush tool is an all-important tool that you use a great deal, and remember that you have all these different options by clicking over here of of all the different brushes you can work with. I've actually set up my palettes over here so that I have my little brushes palette here, and if I click onto there, it comes up with a whole gallery of all my brushes that I can choose, and then I can even look at different options about whether they're a textured brush and how they scatter, how they repeat, what dynamics they have, the pen pressure. There's a whole raft of options in there to play with. Obviously a lot to do with the brush tool there. We also, under the brush tool, have a simple pencil tool that allows you to draw like a pencil line around something. Again, not a tool that I tend to use a great deal. However, I am a big user of the brush tool. A history tool we've looked at. The rubber tool, or the eraser tool, you can use this for rubbing away parts of an image, and you can see I'm rubbing through to a transparent background here. Ideally, you never delete anything in your artwork. The best thing to do is to use a layer mask to hide bits that you want in your artwork. I'm just going to undo that. The graduation tool here allows us to run a color graduation, and by default it will usually pick up your foreground to your background color. So if I now click and drag over there, it's done a green to blue graduation, or I could go in the other direction. From the little panel at the top here, we can do radial graduations, and then you can do some really quite funky shaped ones that Photoshop offers at the same time. And then clicking onto here, as it comes up with a gallery of these which you can add to. So I could choose a nice little spectrum graduation and then run something like that, which is nice. I'm just going to select my history and click back onto my opening snapshot to then just take me back to the original biker image. Here we have the blur tool, and again this is modified through a brush. You choose the size of the brush you want to work with. So I'm just going to hit the 2 keys to the right of P to take the size of my brush up, and then we have the strength of that blurring, and then I can just hand blur over an area just to keep slowly knocking something more and more out of focus. Very similar obviously to using the filter menu and any of the blur commands, but this is much more of a hand blurring technique. Again, I'm just going to go back to my opening snapshot. Underneath the blur tool, if we click and keep our finger down, is the sharpen tool, which guess what this one does? If I take my brush size up, then this allows you to sharpen an area of an image. So it's hand sharpening. Personally, I would prefer to use the sharpen filter and to use unsharp mask and to use low values in here. Usually values of around about 32 and 0 I might tend to use. So if I just do those, I might sharpen the image using those values, and that's usually, for my money, a slightly better or more controllable way, but I do use it sometimes. Also under here, a great fun tool, the smudge tool, and this is really just like a wet finger through slightly drying paint, so you can see the effect that it's just having here. You can smudge little elements off. Here we have the burn tool. You also have dodging and sponging. If I burn an area, I've chosen the midtones and quite a high exposure, and if I then drag over here, the burn tool is a hand darkening tool. Now this is a very useful tool, and you use this a great deal, a lot in retouching, face retouching, darkening up areas of skin. Correspondingly, we then have the dodge tool, and the dodge tool lightens areas. So one of the techniques I tend to show people a lot is how to neutralize blemishes and bits and pieces in skin. Yes, we could clone them, yes, we could healing brush them, but you can quite often dodge and burn an area. The other tool we have over here is the sponge tool, and the sponge tool is really a saturate color, i.e. make the colors more rich and gorgeous, or desaturate colors. So from this menu, I'm going to choose to saturate the colors, and if I now click over here and start to rub over here, is you'll see that the colors are getting much more vivid and intense. I'm only doing it at a light flow. If I chose desaturate from this list, is that this will then make the colors duller and drabber and eventually move them towards grey. So it's a very much a sort of a hand brushing technique really. Pen tool we've covered to a degree. The zoom tool here can be called up. There's a little shortcut which is holding down Apple and spacebar on Mac or Control and spacebar on Windows, and it will override whatever tool you've currently got with the zoom tool. And if you hold down Apple Alt and spacebar on a Mac or Control Alt and spacebar on Windows, it will override your current tool with the zooming out tool. So a very useful way of bringing that one up. The hand tool, if I just zoom in, the hand tool allows you to move an image around, but again, I tend to prefer to be keeping another tool in my hand, and just hold down the spacebar is a shortcut to that hand tool. But don't forget, double clicking the hand tool will recenter the image to the size of the screen. The eyedropper tool, using your info palette, if I just call up my info palette, allows me to sample the color values, and I've also shown you in another of these tutorials how we can use the color sampler tool. So there's a quick run through of some of the tools, not all of them because there's quite a few, but remember, most of the tools are usually delivered through a certain size of the brush, and as usual the devil's in the details, so make sure you check all the settings at the top.